Hello and welcome to our very special episode dedicated to the absolute worst of humanity, corrupt politicians. Now, I know what you're thinking, John, isn't that a bit redundant? Aren't all politicians at least a little bit corrupt? And to that, I say, fair point, but some leaders take corruption to truly Olympic levels, making even the most cynical among us say, come on mate, at least leave some scraps for the rest of us. We're talking about leaders who treat their national treasuries like personal piggy banks, who confuse public service with self-service, and whose definition of transparency involves hiding behind a truly impressive stack of offshore shell companies. Over the next hour, we're diving deep into the cesspool of corruption to expose 5 presidents who've earned their place in the Hall of Shame. We're talking about dictators, strongmen, and even a few folks who managed to get elected democratically, only to reveal their true colors once they got a taste of power. So buckle up, dear viewers, as we embark on a wild ride through embezzlement, cronyism, and enough financial chicanery to make Bernie Madoff blush. This is going to be a bumpy ride, and trust me, you're going to want to wash your hands after this one. Our first stop on this tour of tyranny takes us to the beautiful islands of the Philippines, a nation blessed with stunning beaches, vibrant culture, and sadly, a history marred by Ferdinand Marcos. Now, Marcos wasn't some random dude who stumbled into power. This guy was a genuine lawyer. He even claimed to have been a war hero, though those claims later turned out to be about as credible as a Facebook conspiracy theory. He was elected president in 1965, and at first things seemed not terrible. But like a mango left out in the sun too long, things quickly went sour. You see, Marcos had this insatiable appetite, not for adobo or lumpia, but for money, and lots of it. And where did he get this money, you ask? Oh, just from the Filipino people who he apparently saw as his personal ATMs. We're talking about billions of dollars siphoned away from public funds, leaving the country's economy in shambles. It's estimated that Marcos and his cronies embezzled anywhere between $5 billion to $10 billion during his reign. That's enough money to buy you a private island, and then another island to use as a helipad for your private island. But Marcos wasn't just greedy, he was also a brutal dictator, ruling with an iron fist for over 2 decades. He silenced dissent with violence and intimidation, imprisoning, torturing, and even killing his opponents. It was basically like if I started censoring the Last Week Tonight YouTube comments, but instead of just deleting mean comments, I sent a swarm of bees to their houses. All right, let's hop on over to the African continent, shall we? Specifically to the Democratic Republic of Congo, or as it was known during the reign of our next corrupt character, Zaire. Now, Zaire under Mobutu Sese Seko wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Imagine if your local DMV was run by a leopard skin hat-wearing dictator with a penchant for embezzlement. That's Zaire in a nutshell. Mobutu came to power in 1965, promising stability and prosperity after a period of turmoil. He even initially presented himself as a revolutionary, a man of the people. He was basically the political equivalent of those before pictures you see in weight loss ads, full of promise, but ultimately destined to disappoint. But it didn't take long for Mobutu to reveal his true colors, which, as it turns out, were primarily dollar bill green. He quickly consolidated his power, transforming Zaire into a one-man show where he called all the shots and pocketed most of the profits, and by profits, we mean the entire national treasury. See, Mobutu had this charming habit of treating Zaire's coffers like his personal checking account. Government funds were routinely diverted to his own accounts, used to finance his lavish lifestyle and funneled to his cronies. His regime was so brazen in its corruption that it was practically a masterclass in kleptocracy. It was like watching a pack of raccoons loose in a dumpster fire made of money, chaotic, messy, and deeply unethical. All right, strap in, folks, because we're heading to Peru, a country with a history as rich and complex as a plate of lomo saltado. But unlike that delicious dish, this story has a bitter aftertaste. See, in 1990, Peru was grappling with hyperinflation so severe it would make Weimar Germany blush. We're talking prices doubling every 13 days. To put that in perspective, you could have bought a car with a wheelbarrow full of cash one day, and the next day, you'd need a dump truck. Enter Alberto Fujimori, an unassuming agricultural engineer who, through a series of frankly baffling campaign promises, managed to convince a desperate nation he was the man for the job. He promised economic stability and to tackle the Shining Path, a Maoist guerrilla group terrorizing the country. Spoiler alert, he kind of did both those things, but at a cost that, well, let's just say Peru is still paying off the interest. Think of it like this. You hire a contractor to fix your leaky roof. He does in record time, but then he also fixes your plumbing by ripping out all the pipes and replacing them with garden hoses. Sure, the water technically flows, but it's a chaotic, leaky mess. That's Fujimori in a nutshell effective, but with a complete disregard for the established order, especially when it came to things like, democracy and human rights. So, while Peruvians were busy celebrating the end of hyperinflation and the decline of the Shining Path, Fujimori was busy consolidating power, rewriting the constitution, and generally behaving less like a democratically elected leader and more like a Bond villain who'd just discovered the joys of executive orders. And that, my friends, is where things start to get really interesting, or as interesting as a story about government corruption can be, which, admittedly, isn't saying much. And at number 4, we have Suharto, the man who smiled his way through a 31-year reign over Indonesia. Now you might be thinking, 31 years, that's a hell of a long time to be president. And you'd be right. It seems even dictators get term limits wrong when there are no term limits. Suharto's rule, much like your friend who hogs the karaoke mic, went on for a tad too long. Suharto came to power in the aftermath of what Indonesia calls the 65 coup, a tragically bloody period that to this day remains shrouded in fog and misinformation. Let's just say a lot of people disappeared, and it wasn't your friendly neighborhood magician making them vanish. This event cast a long shadow over Suharto's rule, a shadow that only deepened as his grip on power tightened. Now you might be expecting a flamboyant dictator story, the kind where the leader has a penchant for gold-plated toilets and pet tigers. But Suharto was different. He was more of a subtle corruption kind of guy. Think of him as the dictator who brought Tupperware to a potluck. Practical, unassuming, but ultimately there to take advantage of the situation. He ran Indonesia like his own personal business, a family affair where, if your last name wasn't Suharto, you were probably getting a raw deal. This system, my friends, is what we in the biz call crony capitalism, which is a much fancier way of saying giving all the best government contracts to your golf buddies. And finally, we arrive at number 5 on our list, a man whose name has become synonymous with political scandal, Richard Nixon. Now, before we dive into the whole Watergate debacle, let's remember that Nixon's presidency wasn't all bad. He did some good things. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, for example. Yes, that's right, the same Richard Nixon who allegedly threw away his own handwritten notes by flushing them down the toilet also cared about the environment. It's a complicated legacy, folks. And we're talking about a Kardashian level, but here we can't ignore the fact that Nixon's paranoia and hunger for power led him down a very dark path, a path that ultimately ended in disgrace and resignation. It all started with a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. Now you might be thinking, a break-in, that's it? What is this, an episode of Scooby-Doo? But this wasn't some clumsy attempt to steal snacks from the office vending machine. This was an orchestrated effort to bug the opposition's headquarters, a move straight out of a Cold War spy thriller, except with shaggier carpets and less Sean Connery. The break-in itself was bad enough, but it was the subsequent cover-up, the lies, the hush money, and the abuse of power that turned a second-rate burglary into a full-blown constitutional crisis. Nixon and his cronies, in a move that would make even the most inept criminal mastermind cringe, tried to sweep the whole thing under the rug. They denied involvement, they stonewalled investigators, and they even tried to use the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation. It was like watching a toddler try to hide a cookie jar they just smashed to pieces. The evidence, much like the crumbs scattered across the toddler's face, was everywhere. The media, to their credit, smelled something fishy from the get-go, and they went after the story with the tenacity of a dog with a bone, or perhaps more accurately, a journalist with a Pulitzer Prize in their sights. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, two reporters from the Washington Post, followed the money, connected the dots, and ultimately helped bring down a president. And they did it all while rocking some truly fantastic 1970s hairstyles. Seriously, look it up. They were basically the rock stars of investigative journalism. As the scandal unfolded, the American public watched in disbelief as the president, the most powerful man in the world, was caught red-handed in a web of lies and deceit. It was a betrayal of trust on an epic scale, a political earthquake that shook the foundations of American democracy. Nixon, facing impeachment and the very real possibility of jail time, chose to resign in disgrace in 1974. It was a dramatic end to a tumultuous presidency, a cautionary tale about the corrosive effects of unchecked power and the importance of a free and independent press. Watergate wasn't just a scandal, it was a national trauma. It left a stain on American politics, a deep-seated cynicism that lingers to this day. It's the reason why every political scandal since then has gate tacked onto the end of it, from Irangate to Deflategate. Seriously, we need to come up with a new suffix. It's getting ridiculous. But amidst the wreckage of Watergate, there was a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the system can work. The rule of law prevailed, the truth came out, and a president was held accountable for his actions. It's a reminder that no one, not even the president, is above the law, and that, my friends, is a beautiful thing. From the Philippines to Indonesia, Zaire to Peru, and even right here in the United States, we've seen how corruption can infect the highest levels of government, eroding trust, undermining institutions, and ultimately harming the very people those in power are supposed to serve. These stories, as shocking and infuriating as they are, serve as a reminder that we, the people, must remain vigilant. We must hold our leaders accountable, demand transparency, and fight to protect the institutions that safeguard our democracies. Because the fight against corruption is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, a willingness to speak truth to power, and a commitment to building a better, more just world for all. And on that note, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.